Austin Wintory, and it's a real pleasure to be contributing to this. Forgive my voice, and if I cough periodically. I've been shaking off a bit of a cold or something the last few days, and it's made me constantly need to cough. So anyway, I hope it's okay. I know this is a relatively brief chat, so I just wanted to give a little bit of a general kind of quick and dirty analysis of my process when scoring games, in the hopes that something in here might be helpful or useful to you all in your own careers, in your own games, projects in general, no matter what your discipline is. So I figured what I could start by doing is looking at a couple of past games of mine and showcasing what it is that I did, and then I'm going to just kind of summarize how they all connect to each other. So I'll start with the first and most obvious example. 90% of the time, if somebody reaches out to me about talking about my work, it's because of the game Journey, released by that game company in 2012. This was a life-changing project, something that I remain to this day deeply, deeply, deeply grateful and excited to have been able to work on. And so if you look at the general palette of Journey, you will see it consists of a lot of solo cello, a lot of a handful of other additional solo instruments like flute, harp, viola, and then there's a bunch of kind of electronic textural soundscape type instruments. And then as we get farther and farther into the game and the narrative progression of it, a very modest string orchestra starts to kind of appear and flesh out the sound. And this is all very deliberate. One of the first things that I do when beginning a new project is try to identify what could be a good sound, for lack of a better way to put it, for this game. And by that I mean I want each score to have its own quality, to have its own kind of musical signature, which means that the particular choices of instruments, certain kinds of musical gestures, not to get too technical on the musical side, but different types of harmonies and even voicings of chords, melodic gestures, that kind of thing. Sometimes this includes the deliberate forgive me. Sometimes this includes the deliberate inclusion of like cultural affects, but I'll get to that with a different score in a minute. Needless to say, I want to try to find a kind of bag of tricks that sum up together to becoming that score, to just kind of that add up in a way that really kind of define that sonic signature. So with Journey, the delicate grouping of these instruments is at the core of it. And so the question is why? Well, Journey is fundamentally about a couple of things. It's about loneliness on behalf of the player, and then it's about the cathartic release that comes from finding somebody and escaping that loneliness. Again, my apologies. I promised I would do the video. I'm going to do the video. So finding another player that is meant to feel like a deeply emotional experience. Genova Chen, the creative director on the game, always talked about how imagine you're hiking in the wilderness and you haven't seen anybody for hours and hours and hours. When you pass somebody on the trail, it's a really exciting moment, and it's maybe even a kind of genuinely emotional one if you really let yourself believe it, and you let yourself be affected by the idea that, hey, I'm not alone in this world. Here's somebody, here's proof. He wanted the music to really help capture that moment, in addition to the fact that, of course, the story itself from beginning to end is telling this larger arc the so-called monomyth. So it had to be music which could channel the power of the hero's journey, but which was mostly built on this idea of loneliness. So the notion of a solo cello embodying the player and becoming almost like their musical representative, surrounded by little bits of color here and there that kind of come and go and then culminate in this lusher, larger sound as you reach a kind of transcendent finale. This was all very much chosen by design, and specifically the idea that it's not an orchestral score. It's not a big, grand, sweeping 100-piece symphony orchestra. That was very on purpose. I did not feel like when playing the game, something of that level of size and scope would feel right to this core notion of loneliness. So moving on to a different game, one I started shortly after Journey was released in 2012, first released in 2014, a game called The Banner Saga. The Banner Saga is a trilogy of games that are inspired by Norse mythology. It's a tactical, turn-based strategy game mixed with a kind of decision tree travel game, kind of vaguely in the vein of the Oregon Trail. So imagine, Final Fantasy Tactics, or even something as elegant as chess mixed with the Oregon Trail. That's the underlying kind of mechanical makeup of the Banner Saga. But at its heart, this is a story about characters who are facing some kind of apocalyptic event and trying to figure out how to cope with it. So the apocalyptic event is rather grand in its scope. The game begins where the sun stops in the sky at high noon and then refuses to move further. So they're stuck in perpetual daylight, which adds an additional piece of subtext. Every character in the game is kind of perpetually exhausted. They can't sleep. And then this wall of enemies appears that starts to push them further and further and further from home as you travel across the landscape. So I found myself thinking about two main ideas. One I mentioned is this concept of exhaustion. Your characters are these big warrior types who are very powerful and very capable of very capable skill-wise in battle. And I liked the idea that I was trying to simultaneously channel their strength, but the fact that they are not excited about battle. They are world weary. They are exhausted from this whatever apocalyptic event that is occurring. And so the music could have a kind of large and muscular quality, but it should feel more forlorn and almost maybe borderline like a funeral march. So my starting point for the score was a big, in contrast to Journey, a big brass-filled and low woodwind-filled kind of, this now was orchestral, but focusing on the most muscular parts of the orchestra. So much so that I thought, in the interest of stylizing the music to be more unique, what if it was a large orchestra, but no strings? So typically, a traditional orchestra has strings, which make up about half of the orchestra, and then brass, woodwinds, and percussion. So I said, well, what if we get rid of one of those? And then we make the rest of the orchestra bigger to compensate. So a lot of brass, a lot of winds, and a lot of percussion. Originally recorded by the Dallas Wind Symphony in Dallas, Texas. We did the entire trilogy, Banner Saga 1, 2, and 3, this way. A large wind ensemble, as it's known, type orchestra. And it worked great. It really helped capture that feeling of almost like a funeral march. It was very powerful. But the second and very crucial component was these are characters that are trying to deal with death. The apocalyptic event, to me, felt like a metaphor to the fact that we all must face the end of our own life, and we must deal with our own death. And so this was a game that was kind of fundamentally about having the courage to look at death right in the face and know that you can summon the courage to deal with it with strength and with honor. And that also was where this idea came from of, well, what if it kind of has that kind of funeral nobility to it? I think that could be something that's maybe quite powerful. I'll use one last game as an example, which was Assassin's Creed Syndicate. I had the great pleasure of working with Ubisoft on their long-running and rather amazing Assassin's Creed franchise. And for Syndicate, once again, the question at the beginning was, where to start. And they started telling me about the storyline of the game. And one of the things that really stood out was that it was about two twin siblings, brother and sister, Jacob and Evie Fry, who were twin assassins, and you play as both of them in the game. And they were both very kind of young and arrogant. And so while a lot of the Assassin's Creed games have tended to focus on the origin story of how your player character comes to join the Order of Assassins, this one, you start out as assassins, and as young, brash ones at that. On top of this, there was this concept of their father having been an assassin and dealing with his legacy and their kind of difficult relationship with him. So I thought, well, what if there's a theme that's pensive, even a bit anxious, and maybe even a tad despondent and kind of poignant, like it's got a little wistful kind of sadness to it. I called it Bloodlines in the end. And the idea is that the theme is about their struggling to deal with legacy and this relationship with their father. And then as soon as the game actually starts and you get past that reflective, opening idea, particularly the combat music, becomes very focused on their arrogance. And one of the ideas that I pitched that I was certain Ubisoft was going to be not too crazy about, but to my great pleasure, they were very into it, was the idea that their arrogance leads to treating combat as a kind of dance, like a waltz, a dance of death, meaning you, Jacob or Evie, think your enemies are so non-threatening that you engage in a fight as a playful experience and not as an actually dangerous one. And so that took me down this road of a kind of 19th century chamber ensemble of just, 9 strings, 3 violins, 3 violas, 3 cellos, maybe 2 flutes, 2 oboes, depending on which combat sequence you're in, or maybe 2 trumpets, but otherwise keeping it very, very light, very lean, and very kind of agile, but fundamentally sarcastic, and about this idea that we're fighting, but I'm better than you. That was the kind of fundamental premise that I had fun with. So what's the summary of all this? These and every other project I've worked on, I always begin with this fundamental question. What is the game actually about? That's what all of these little stories have in common. Journey is really actually about loneliness intermingled with the hero's journey and the cathartic release that comes from connecting with another person. Assassin's Creed Syndicate is fundamentally about the kind of sarcastic dance of death while simultaneously trying to deal with the pain of a lost father and reconciling yourself to his legacy. Or the Banner Saga, what is it really about? It's about the courage to look death in the face while being exhausted at a life that is being very cruel to you. You could even boil these things even further down, like the Banner Saga is about the essence of what is our mortality. That's really what it can be boiled down to. These are always the questions that I begin with. I always sit down with the developer at the very beginning, and before we look at anything specific, I don't want to know about lore yet. I do immediately, but as the second step. The first step is, what is the fundamental archetypal story that you're trying to tell? What is the most boiled down just essence? Is it about love? Is it about forgiveness? Is it about exploring primal rage and what it can do to us, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Get it down to whatever is that really, really, really core basic essence, and then from there start to say, okay, now how do I characterize that with music? And that's where then a lot of further discussion of, okay, well, what's our storyline? What is our time and place? What is our setting? What kind of emotional takeaway do we want the players to have? all that kind of thing. What are unique ways we can stylize this? And it goes from there. This is a really quick and dirty summary, like I said, but hopefully it helps. I'm sorry I couldn't come in person. I really enjoy traveling to give these kinds of talks, and I hope it was helpful.